you about ensemble working, which, if you don't know what that means, it is more commonly referred to as mob programming. So let's start by explaining that, in case you're not quite sure what it is. So I call it ensemble working, and Emily Bates, who actually is based in Sweden, who I work with quite frequently, she also likes to call it ensemble working. Woody Zuhl, who is the person who first really popularized the approach, originally called it mob programming, but these days he likes to call it software teaming. So that's at least 3 different ways of describing it. But ensemble working is my preferred term. I don't really mind. I'm not going to get terribly upset if people use other words to describe it. The important thing is what you do, not what you call it. The reason I don't like mob, and the reason Woody has also moved away from mob, is because the word mob suggests an angry mob. It makes you think of people rampaging through streets with pitchforks, which is not at all what mob programming is about. So ensemble is a good word because it means together, and that's what it's all about. So Woody likes to say this: all the brilliant minds working together on the same thing at the same time, in the same space, and at the same computer. So this is pair programming to the power of 10, or to the power of however many people you have in your team. Typically, ensembles will be between 5 and 10 people. I think that once you get more than 5, then you start to struggle a bit. So it's a small group of people, but they are all working at the same computer. So typically, they are writing code together. Writing code is not the only thing you can do in an ensemble, but typically it's a group of people writing code. I mean, that's an oversimplification. Developing software, in fact. So that's not just about writing code, but writing and deploying and designing and considering code together as a group. And so what you're doing is gathering all the people with the skills and knowledge that you need in order to develop your software. So although typically it is focused around coding, quite often the power of the ensemble is that you have people in the room who are not just software developers. You can bring particularly the QAs, the testers, into the room. That's particularly useful. You can bring business analysts into the room. You can bring product owners into the room. You can bring domain experts into the room. You can bring whoever you need in order to get the job done. So it's the people with all the skills and the knowledge that you need. And these people are all completely different from each other, and that's part of the power. You're bringing them all together. So instead of the limitations that individuals have, what you have is extra people helping to steady them. Those are my 2 sons. That's Oscar on the right and Felix on the left. And I suppose, proud parent moment, I can't help mentioning that Felix is now a professional circus performer, and also, as of 3 weeks ago yesterday, is a father, and I'm a grandma. Enough of that. So I'm actually going to start with the objections, because it does sound like, oh, is this not working? Okay. So the reason you could hear me was just because I've got a loud voice.
We heard that.
Okay, how about that? Right, so now I'm being recorded as well as audible to the people in the room. Luckily, I haven't said anything terribly important yet. Okay, so if you haven't heard about it before, and even if you have heard about it, you might think it doesn't sound realistic, it doesn't sound sensible, it doesn't sound like something that you would be able to do. And even if you think it sounds like a good idea, you might think, I'm going to struggle to persuade anybody else that it's a good idea, particularly people who hold purse strings and are responsible for managing companies. How on earth are you going to persuade them that it is a good idea for everybody to sit at the same machine and write one piece of software together. So I'm going to start with those objections, and then I'm going to go on to the good stuff. So one of the reasons that managers don't like the sound of it is that they want to be able to have a feel for how individuals are doing. And how do you do that if everybody's doing the same thing at the same time all at once? How on earth are you going to know whether that person is doing well? So managers often want to be able to measure individual productivity. But the thing is, you can't. So I'm going to talk a bit about why you can't really measure individual productivity in software development. And the reason that you can't measure individual software development is the same reason that Ensemble work doesn't have the negative impact that you might think it did. So it doesn't have the negative impact on team productivity that people think it might. And that's connected to the reason that you can't really measure individual productivity of software engineers. And the simple answer to why not is because software development is absolutely fundamentally a team-based activity. It's collaborative whether you like it or not. And actually, the more collaborative you can make it, the more effective you will be. Now, people do try to resist the fact that software is a collaborative activity. They try to do it on their own. They try to split teams into atomized individuals rather than people who are working highly collaboratively. But it's been shown over and over again that the more collaborative you are when you build software, the more effective you are. That when people go off on their own, they are more likely to make mistakes, and it's harder to integrate what they've done and what they've learnt with whatever the rest of the team and the rest of the whole company needs. Because teams are not just individuals working in parallel. If you have 5 engineers building software together, you will not have 5 straight lines that are independent from each other. The work streams of those 5 people will be connected, whether they like it or not. And the collaboration has to happen. But people make assumptions about software development that simply aren't correct. Now, this is from an article by Daniel Terhorst-North in response to an article, a report that was published by McKinsey recently, which I will get onto. But I just want to look at these 2 things that Daniel North points out, which is that people make false assumptions about software development. One of them is that it is a reducible activity that can be measured with reductionist tools, and I will explain that. The other is that it is primarily about coding, that software development is about writing code. Both of those things, not that you can do it without writing code, you need to write code, but it's not primarily about writing code. So let's look at that first one. Software development is a reducible activity. So what Daniel says is, it is a fallacy that software development is reducible, like building a wall, where you can measure who lays the most bricks or whose work is the neatest and needs the fewest corrections. So when I say reducible, what I mean is you can't reduce it to just a number of bricks and say, this developer made these bricks, this one made these bricks, these are good bricks, well laid, these are bad bricks, badly laid, therefore this person is good, this person is not so good, because it's not that simple. You can't just reduce it down like that. And then what Daniel does is he goes on to talk about the worst programmer he knows. So this is actually a separate article, but it's linked to from the first one. And he talks about a guy called Tim McKinnon. And the company that he worked for came up with a way of measuring productivity for software engineers. And what they did was they measured it by the number of stories that were completed by each engineer. And they used Jira, and every ticket in Jira had a software engineer's name assigned to it, and then they counted how many stories stories each developer completed, and Tim McKinnon's score was 0. Not one single ticket had his name on it. So they came to Daniel, who was the manager of the team at the time, and they said, get rid of that guy. We've been measuring the productivity of these developers, and that one is the least productive. He doesn't produce anything. And Daniel said, absolutely no. And the reason his score was 0 was that he never signed up for any stories. Instead, what he did was spend his whole day pairing with his teammates. And he was very, very good at helping to teach the inexperienced people, and with the more experienced people being somebody that they could bounce ideas off, helping them to spot where they were going well. He would learn from the experience as well, but he always paired with other people, and he never put his name on any of those tickets. But he was a multiplier. He had an incredibly beneficial effect on the rest of the team. And what Daniel also says is your highest value developers are 10 times because they are enabling other developers. So there's this idea of the 10x developer, which interestingly, depending on context, people use that phrase in different ways. Sometimes people talk about 10x and they just mean this developer is 10 times faster than anybody else. But a much better way of using it is to say this developer has an influence on so many other developers that they improve and increase the output of the whole team by a power of 10 by their presence. And actually, that's the most useful thing you can do with your best developers, is put them with other developers so that they can share their knowledge and expertise, so that they can help other developers to be really good, because collaboration makes such a difference in software engineering. So the next thing is whether software development is primarily about coding. No, is the simple answer. But actually, programming is not just about coding, not by a long chalk. It's about learning the business domain. Don't need to code to do that. Understanding the problem, that's not about coding. Assessing possible solutions. You don't actually code while you're doing that. Validating assumptions through feedback and experimentation. Coding is part of that, but only a small part. Ensuring consistency at scale. Identifying, assessing, and meeting cross-functional needs, such as compliance, security, availability, resilience, accessibility, usability, and the list goes on. That's not about coding. Anticipating likely vectors of change without over-engineering. So that's being able to look ahead, think about the design of your system, think about the architecture of your system. Assessing and choosing suitable technologies. Identifying and leveraging pre-existing solutions. All of those things are not about having hands on the keyboard writing code. And all of those things benefit from collaboration. So can you measure individual developer activity? Well, this is where we come to the McKinsey report, which was published a few weeks ago and followed instantly, or almost instantly, by a bunch of rebuttals. So I've just showed you a few quotes from Daniel North's article, and I'm going to look a little bit about what Kent Beck and Gergely Oroz said about it. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, sorry. So there's some links there. There are more links for people talking about it. But let's look about whether you can measure individual developer productivity. So let's start by thinking about how software engineering creates value. When you're building and delivering software, the first thing that happens is the effort. So you spot a customer pain point. You brainstorm how to solve it. You make a plan. You write the code. You ship the code. That's the effort that goes into it. And out of that comes outputs. So some examples of some outputs. There might be some design documents. There'll be the actual code written. There'll be the actual feature in production. That's the output. But then there are the outcomes. This is what you wanted. This is why the software was built. The software wasn't built because you wanted design docs. The software was built because you wanted to have an impact on your customers. So a nice broad description of that is that your customers are going to behave differently in some way. And then the impact of that is that value is generated. So that might be financial value, that might be that you have less churn. There are lots of different ways that you can measure value. It's going to depend on your business, but the impact is the value. So that's how software creates value. And now let's look at some other areas and think about how they measure individual contributors. So this is an example of what a sales team might look like. And going back to the original question, we wanted to try and measure individual developer productivity. Why do we want to do that? Because typically somebody who's running a business is dealing with more than one department. Engineering is just one function of the business. They've also got other departments like sales and recruitment. And the sales and recruitment people come to them and quite easily give them ways of measuring individual contributions. So let's look at sales as an example. The effort that goes into sales is collecting leads, getting meetings with them, tailoring quotes, doing follow-ups. The output of all of that is going to be emails, quotes, contract drafts, but the outcome is the number of deals closed and the number of deals pending, and the total financial value of closed deals. And the impact is the percent of target that's been hit. Retention, upsell, churn. When we measure people in sales, we don't measure them on effort and output. We measure them on outcome and impact. And what we ask is, has this individual salesperson hit a particular target? What's the value of the deals that they've closed? That's the kind of thing we measure. And it's not even that difficult. It's quite easy to measure individuals on that basis. So now we get to the McKinsey report, which I'm not going to go into in loads of detail, but what McKinsey claim is that they've found a way of measuring developer productivity, but the new things that they've added are all focused on effort and output. And there's a reason for this, because software engineering is different. So these are these new measures that McKinsey have come up with, and they are nearly all focused on effort and output. There is one that's on impact. And the problem is, first of all, to understand why this is problematic, let's think about the fact that measures become targets. So this is a quote from the article: measuring leads to behavior change. Behavior change, including coming up with creative ways to improve those measurement scores, even at the expense of results that everyone agrees matter. So you try to measure software engineers, for instance, on things like the number of bugs fixed or the number of stories delivered. And that very quickly then becomes something that people are measured on and judged by. So Kent tells this story of when he was working at Facebook, and they would regularly have surveys where they would ask developer about various things. But what happened was the scores from these surveys started to be rolled up. So if your developers were doing well, then you were doing well. And their scores became your score. So as a manager, you're trying to encourage your developers to answer those questions in such a way that it makes you look good. And now people at the top are saying, well, the ones that have the lowest scores are the ones we're going to get rid of. So now it's very much in your interest to make sure those scores look good. So you're no longer measuring how people are performing, you're just encouraging them to game the system. And you may well have heard of Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Now, the reason I talk about all of that is because those things that were being measured by McKinsey went into the effort and output section. So to remind you again, when we're measuring salespeople, we look at outcome and impact. But these were focused on effort. And the problem is, the reason this is so difficult is because the outcomes and the impact in software are team-based. So in sales, you can measure outcomes and impact on an individual basis. In software, you can't, which is why people end up trying to measure effort and output instead. And I am going to move on from this, but this is the nearly the end of this bit, but if you look at outcome and impact in software, we do have really good metrics for those, and those are the DORA metrics. So these are the DORA metrics, and they are all focused on outcome and impact. If you haven't come across the DORA metrics, I do encourage you to look them up, but they're a really good way of measuring how well a team is delivering software. So deployment frequency, how frequently are you deploying your software? Lead time for changes, how long does it take to get new features into production? Mean time to recover, how quickly can you recover when there's a problem in production? Change failure rate, how many of the changes that you deploy lead to failure, lead to problems in production? These are really useful metrics. They're almost impossible to measure on an individual basis. They are team metrics. So just finally, what Ken and Gergely say in their article is, the problem is, if you look at this, it took me a while to understand this diagram, but the things on the left are things that are easy to measure on an individual basis. So effort, output. The things on the right are harder to measure on an individual basis, but easier to measure on a team basis. The things above the line are things that have high alignment with the goals of the business, things that are actually going to be important to the business. So those are outcomes and impact. The things below the line are not aligned well with the group, that is the business, the organization. They're much more individual. And when you encourage people to aim for targets, it's everyone for themselves. And you end up with the problem of people gaming the system. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Let's talk about ensembles. The reason that I went through all of that was because I wanted to talk about how when you're worried about whether an ensemble will work, that often comes from the idea that you're worried about how productive individual team members are. And actually, you're worried about the wrong thing. If you care about the impact that your software has, then what you care about is how the team functions, because software is fundamentally a collaborative, team-based exercise, and that's why ensemble working is so good, because what you're doing is you're putting the team together and you are maximizing collaboration. It's also worth remembering that your situation is unique to you. Now, the reason I mention this is because the next question people always have is, show us some proof. We want to know that ensemble working has a really positive impact on various measures. And even though you can measure outcomes and impact on a team basis, it's very difficult to measure the effectiveness of ensemble working. And the reason it's so difficult is because it's extremely difficult to get a decent academic level study that is scientific and trustworthy, because you can't have control measures. It's almost impossible to put two teams in an identical situation where one of them is working as an ensemble and one of them isn't, and measure the outcomes and the impact. You can't, because they won't be in identical situations. So it's really, really difficult to prove that ensembles, like really properly, academically, rigorously prove that ensembles are more effective. But there is a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that people who do work with ensembles are very happy with it. They do feel that it goes well for them. The reason I say your situation is unique to you is that actually, if you want to know whether it works, you have to try it. You have to see whether it does work in your situation. Because even if I were able to have two teams in identical circumstances and measure the outcomes and the impact of those two teams, one in an ensemble and one not, they're going to have a completely different situation to whatever your situation is. So there isn't much point in me trying to show you evidence. But it's interesting when I asked some colleagues about this, are you aware of any evidence for the benefits of ensemble work? And one of my colleagues, Ted, said that he'd been trying to find it, but had recognized that it's extremely difficult. And then he said, I find trying to seek evidence as a way of looking, as actually a way of looking for a quick and easy answer and avoiding experimenting. Because actually, the best way to know whether something works for you is to try it. And it also, there's another question, which is what metrics are you focused on? Do you care about just outcomes and impact in terms of value delivered to the business, or do you also care about things like retention and job satisfaction? Because those are also things that can be impacted by highly collaborative ways of working. And they are generally positively impacted by highly collaborative ways of working. And I'll come back to that. But it's also worth remembering that quality is a long-term thing. So one thing that you will find with both pair programming and ensemble working is that initially it does feel slower, because there is a lot of quality checks in place. So if you send a developer off on their own, they can work really fast. They can churn out new features, but they are likely to be lower quality because nobody except them saw what they were doing. So even if they're really good at their job, there will be lots of extra sources of knowledge that we're missing. Knowledge about the domain, knowledge about the code base, knowledge about integrations with third parties, knowledge about customers. A whole bunch of stuff is missing from that equation when somebody works on their own. So yes, they can sometimes work quickly, but the quality is likely to be lower. There will be unforeseen problems with what they've done that won't come up straight away. They're also much more likely to disappear down a rabbit hole, which is something most developers, even the best of us, are capable of. And with nobody else seeing what we're doing, we can get disappearing off completely the wrong path for quite a long time before anybody notices, including ourselves. But quality is a long-term thing. So yes, I can deliver something really quickly. I can deliver a new feature for you really quickly. But then the trouble starts. It can happen straight away that yes, I've delivered it in that I've built it. But now we can't integrate it with some other thing, or we can't deploy it. So deliver is in the eye of the beholder. Quite often you can deliver quickly, which means you can write the code quickly, but then there's a whole bunch of other stuff you have to do. But even if you get it into production, if you do it quickly, chances are, depending on what practices you've used, there's going to be bugs. And they might not show up straight away. So what you want to, when people are in a hurry, what you have to ask people is, okay, so that feature got delivered really quickly, and then what happened? Did you deliver another one really quickly after that, and then another, and then another, and then another, and back to back to back? Or did it all stop at some point because you had to fix problems in production? How much of your time got taken up, and how did that get worse over time? And it's not just that you start having to fix bugs in production, the tech debt builds up as well. If you move quickly, if individuals move quickly without collaboration, there's a much higher likelihood that the tech debt is increasing, and then that has to be addressed at some point, and the bugs increase. So you have to look long term. It's not just about how quickly you're moving now, it's how quickly can you move on average over time, because you're not being held back by tech debt and bugs. Okay. But what about individuals? So I've been talking about how you persuade businesses that ensemble work is a good idea, but it's not just people at the top who don't like the sound of it. It's quite often individuals, and we were talking about this at lunch, and I'm actually, it might not be obvious, but I am one of them. There is a tendency for people who work in tech to only really want to talk to computers. And I actually joined this industry because I thought, yes, a job where all I have to do is talk to computers and I don't have to talk to people.
Because weirdly, I don't actually do this all day, every day. I enjoy doing this kind of thing in short bursts, but I do also enjoy just talking to computers and not having to talk to anybody else. And actually, that's not unusual in this industry. So how do you persuade people that it can be enjoyable and rewarding to work in a highly collaborative manner rather than working on your own? And is that even true? Am I just lying? Well, I mean, I can't tell you about everybody, but my own experience is that when I tried it, I loved it. And I also have the experience of introducing ensemble work to people. So this is something I do a lot as a technical coach. And there is often resistance at first, but then people get used to it and they enjoy it. But I do have to say, ensemble work can be done badly as well. So it is entirely possible that somebody could have a negative experience of it and run away screaming. So it's not automatically great. There are skills that you have to learn. But positive experiences make all the difference. So in order to persuade people that actually they might enjoy it, you have to give them positive experiences. This is an article about a company called Late Rooms where I used to work. That's me with different coloured hair over there near the screen. And what happened was I went to a meetup in Manchester in the UK where I live, where there was a guy there doing a talk about mob programming, as we were all calling it then. And he had seen Woody Zool talk about it at a conference. Actually, I think he just watched a video of Woody Zool talking about it. And at this meetup I went to, he showed us the video. So we all watched a video of Woody Zool saying, "Yay, mob programming, brilliant." And he was so enthusiastic, Woody Zool. And not just Woody Zool, the guy who was showing us the video had taken it to his company and tried it out. And what they'd done is they'd started out by saying, well, let's just try it as an experiment for a day and then a week and then 2 weeks, and they all loved it so much that they just never stopped doing it. So these are two voices I'm hearing that are waxing lyrical for how great it is. So I went back to my team and I said, I went to this talk last night and I saw this video and I've heard about this new thing called mob programming and I think maybe we should give it a go. But before I did that, I actually thought to myself, okay, how am I going to persuade them to try this? I thought they're going to be really resistant. They're not going to want to do it. They're going to think it sounds insane. So I thought, well, I'll just use the classic bargaining tool. I'll ask for more than I think I'm going to get. So I'm going to suggest to them that we do mob programming for a whole week, and I might get a day if I'm lucky. So the first thing I suggested was, I didn't even suggest that we try it. I just said, can we take an hour out of our day to watch this video together? Because it's really interesting, and I think you might be interested in this. So we all watched the Woody Zool video together, and then actually we spent some time afterwards talking about it. And then I presented my proposal, which is I think we should try and do this for a whole week, just to see, as an experiment, what does it feel like? You know, and I'm perfectly prepared to say, no, this is rubbish, we hate it, we're never going to do it again. But let's try it. And again, I thought they were going to say, a whole week, don't be ridiculous, you can have a day. But amazingly, they said, okay, then, and we did. We did it for a whole week. Now, we did what Woody suggests. So there are many, many practices that have an impact, and one of them is to have a retro initially at the end of every day. And you might keep doing that indefinitely, but initially at the end of every single day, because it is quite intense. It's a very unusual experience, and you need to respond quickly to problems. So at the end of every single day, you check in with people. How is the experience? Is there anything we need to change? And one of the things that we very quickly discovered was that we didn't like our initial setup. I think that was our second setup, or maybe our first. Anyway, we didn't like that one very much because we were all sort of sitting sideways, because the only table we could find was this strange long thing. So some of us weren't very close to the screen. So after that, we moved into a dedicated meeting room, or tried to, but we couldn't get that screen to fit in the lift. The room that was available was on the next floor up, and that screen did not fit in the lift. So that was a problem. But at the end of the first week, we said, let's do it again for another week. And we did do it for another week. Now, this isn't quite the same story as the guy whose talk I originally saw. We didn't end up doing it full time. But what we did do was take this big table. I mean, actually, that was a very simple fix. We realized that if you put the screen on the long end of the table and not the thin end, probably obvious, but there you go. So what we did was we stole that table. It was originally the boardroom table, but we just claimed it as our own. And we put it next to our bank of desks with that big screen. And then any time we as a team, so we were already working quite collaboratively, and we were working in an environment where we could all see each other. This was pre-COVID. And any time we as a group decided we needed to have a group discussion or look at some code together, we would just move over to that table, plug in the laptop, look at it all on a big screen so we could all see the code together. And we did it a lot. Sometimes we did it on an ad hoc basis. Sometimes we deliberately planned it, like for a new feature, or if we were doing some training, or if we were onboarding a new person. But we had it instantly at our disposal at the drop of a hat whenever we needed it. And for us, that's what worked. For you, it might be different. But what made the difference was having the experience, experimenting, trying and tweaking it for us, but having a positive experience. And I'm going to talk a bit about how you can try to ensure that it is a positive experience. I'm not going to show you this because time, but this is a video. How are we doing for time? What time are we finishing? Oh, maybe I can show you. I'm going to show you this because it's quite short. But it doesn't always work. So sometimes it works embedded, sometimes it doesn't. I haven't been able to work out what makes the difference. But here it is on YouTube. It's very short. It's only 3 minutes. What this is a video of Hunter Industries. And they still do ensemble work there the whole time. So it is absolutely the normal mode of working at Hunter Industries. This is where Woody Zuhl first introduced, as they were still calling it then, mob programming. He introduced it to the company bit by bit, and the whole company loved it, and they ended up just doing it the whole time. This is a time-lapse video of a day in the life of Hunter Industries. It's silent, but there are lots of little pointers and text will come up on the screen to explain what you're looking at. But this is Hunter Industries, and this is a day in the life of them all working in mobs, as they called it then. This is before COVID as well. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. YouTube's done that thing it does. Stop. Okay. So what are the benefits of ensemble work? There are many of them. A really big benefit, and interestingly, companies that are more reluctant about ensemble work, at the very least, they're likely to use it for onboarding. It's really, really effective for onboarding new people. If you imagine somebody new joins your team, they want to get to know the code base, they want to get to know what work you're currently working on, they want to get to know all the people in the team, what all their job roles are, what they know. They could do that a bit at a time, or they could do it all at once. They could get the benefit of everybody's knowledge and expertise all in one go. It's great for onboarding new team members. It's great for starting a new project. So for instance, if you're starting work on a new feature, or if you've decided to introduce a new technology to your estate, it's really good to do that all together as a team, that you all start the work on it together. You all get to understand what the constraints are, how it's going to join with the rest of your domain, how it's going to integrate with any external products. It's really great for learning together. So if, as a team, you've decided that there is a gap in your collective knowledge, for instance, you've decided, again, that you're going to use a new technology or even a new language, you can learn together. It's really good for engagement and job satisfaction. So nobody should be forced to do this. It should be voluntary. Also, people should be able to leave the ensemble when they want. So it shouldn't be something that you have to do all day, every day. But when ensemble work is handled well, it's an incredibly rewarding experience. And it does, again, anecdotally, improve retention and job satisfaction. People who do it love it. So that was the learning side of things. And then there's also the collaboration side of things. I've talked a lot about collaboration already, but when you are collaborating strongly with each other as a team, it does increase quality. And it obliterates context switching. So you know that thing where you're working on one thing and then you have to work on something else. If you're all working on the same thing at the same time, you don't have that context switching. It minimizes bottlenecks. So one of the hidden costs of software engineering, you know, we were talking before about how software engineering isn't just people working in parallel. Because what actually happens is people do a bit of work, and then that work has to be integrated with other bits of work. And so, for instance, a common workflow, which I'm not a fan of, but a common workflow in software engineering is where somebody does a piece of work and then they issue a pull request. And then it doesn't go anywhere until somebody's reviewed that pull request. Now, there's two problems there. First of all, the person who wrote the code is now stuck until somebody's reviewed the pull request. Quite likely they're going to go on and do something else and then lose the context if they have to return to it. Either that or they just have to wait. But the other problem is that the person who reviews the pull request has to stop doing whatever they were doing. All of this slows everything down, increases bottlenecks. And when you're not working directly with each other, you have to wait for each other. And so the more people you have in your team, the more people you're waiting for. You're waiting for their expertise. You're waiting to ask them for something. You're waiting for them to do something. All of that is bottlenecks. That doesn't happen if you're all working together. And you get the best out of everyone. So imagine this red line represents the skill set of an individual. We all tend to have spiky profiles. There are things we're good at, things we're not so good at. So the high points represent the things that somebody's good at, the low points not so good. Here's somebody else. They're different. They have a different profile. They're good at different things. If we put these two on top of each other and then draw a new line that represents all of the peaks, you can see that new green line has got more peaks. It's also more even. The more of these lines we add in, the more that green line at the top levels out. Because what you do is you get everybody's peaks all in one place at the same time. And you get the best out of everybody. But it is a skill. You can't just do it necessarily. And the very first thing that makes an enormous amount of difference, and I would say this is the one that is non-negotiable, everything else can be tweaked because everything else is going to depend on you and your circumstances. But this one is absolutely paramount. You have to be kind to each other. You have to respect each other. You have to pay attention to how people are doing. So when somebody's having a bad day, don't just ignore it. And you're going to notice. You're much more likely to see it because you're all together. But that might mean that this person needs to be treating with extra kindness. It might mean that they're going to do a bit less work. It might mean that they actually do take a step away from the ensemble for various reasons. But what you don't do is, as well, point and laugh at people. So everybody's exposed, and it's one of the reasons that people are scared and think that they won't like it, is because it makes them feel very vulnerable, because everybody's working in front of everybody else. And if you have a team culture where you point and laugh at people if they do things that are wrong, then this is going to be horrible. This is going to be a nasty experience, and nobody's going to want to do it. So if you want it to be a pleasant experience that people respond to and thrive in, you have to have this. But it's great because actually it encourages you to have this. So there are lots of areas in software that are like this, that the things that you need in order to do it well are also the benefits, because you get better at doing this, and this is really important. This is how teams function well, when people are treating each other well, when people are not judging each other for the mistakes that they make and just seeing it as opportunities to learn. So that's your working agreement. And you might have other things in your working agreement. You might have things that are specific to your people and your workplace and your context. And you will build up your own working agreement, but I would highly recommend that that be the first thing on it. Now, everything else is optional. But this is a very common way of doing ensemble working, and it's a very good way of getting started. So even if you don't end up doing it like this, it's a good way to start, is to have quite strong roles. So the facilitator is the person who's keeping an eye on the whole thing. And you might not need a facilitator in time, but initially it's a good idea to have one. And then you have two key roles, who are the typist and the navigator. They're often called driver and navigator, but Emily and I both prefer typist and navigator because I don't really know anything about motor racing. And for me, the driver, because when I drive a car, I'm also navigating. And driving sounds like you're in control and you're making all the decisions. When people use driver navigator, they normally mean that the driver is just at the keyboard, not making decisions. But the word driver doesn't suggest that to me. So, and Emily's had the same problem, and other people have agreed. So we don't use the word driver, but you can substitute driver for typist. The typist is the person who just types whatever they're told, and it's important what they're told. The navigator tells them what to type. And the reason we have these two roles is because otherwise, if the typist is typing what they've decided to type, they won't necessarily tell you what or why. So then what happens is you've got a bunch of people just watching somebody code. And that gets dull and frustrating and confusing very quickly. If they are not allowed to type without being told what to type, that means everybody hears what they're being told. It also means you get good at describing what you're doing in a way that is engaging and interesting and meaningful, which is another useful skill. So initially, this is one way of getting started, is you have these two very strong roles, navigator and typist, and everybody else in the ensemble is a supporter. So they're not just watching. You can ask them for their advice, but then they're not active by default. And then you switch these roles really frequently. People have different times. a lot of people I know like 4 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Once we got into a rhythm at late rooms, we were rotating every 15 minutes. But initially, really short rotations are a good idea because it means that everybody gets around quickly. So there isn't much time for people to drift off and get bored and not pay attention to what's going on. They have to know what's going on because very quickly it's going to be their turn to be the navigator. So facilitator, typist, navigator, supporter, rotate all of them except the facilitator on a regular basis. I think I've just said all of this now. Typist enters code. They know how to use an IDE. They know about shortcuts. They know how to search for stuff. And they will listen to what they're asked to do. A navigator is making the decisions, communicating very clearly, explaining detail if needed, and the supporters help the navigator if they're asked, and also raise concerns because they're quite likely to see things that the navigator hasn't spotted. But you will come up with a way of doing that that works for you. So for instance, if you're online, a really simple way of doing it is the supporters type things into the chat. If they've spotted something, they type it into the chat. And it might be somebody's role to pay attention to it. In fact, generally the facilitator is going to be paying attention to that and making sure the navigator knows about it at an appropriate moment. So if the navigator's like deep in thinking about something, you might not want to interrupt them straight away, but at the next appropriate moment, call their attention to what one of the supporters has spotted. The supporters are also allowed to ask questions, and that's really important. And that's a part of good team collaboration culture anyway, is encouraging and allowing people to ask questions. And then the facilitator can guide the whole thing. And this way of working where you have a typist or driver and navigator is called strong style pairing. Another thing that Emily and I have started doing, which we find works really well, is that when we are, it's not just when we're introducing it, but what we do is we get everybody to shout out their role whenever the timer goes off. So whenever there's a rotation, I might say, I'm Claire and I'm typing. And then somebody else might say, I'm Steve and I'm navigating. And then somebody else might say, I'm Emily and I'm next. It means the person who's next is awake. You know that they're awake. You know that they know that it's going to be their turn next. And it means everybody can keep track of who's doing what. And it means everybody's it just helps to get that rhythm going. And it's really important that you're paying attention to whether people are engaged, because what you don't want is people falling asleep in the corner. So, and there are various things you can do. One of the things that you can do is this intention location details. So this is where the navigator is aware of whether they are working at a high level, a medium level, or a low level. So high level is intention, where what you say to the typist is, write a new test that will test for blah. You don't say anything else. And the typist knows how to write a test. They know how to test for the thing that you're looking for, and they might not need any more than that. And the advantage of that is not only are you not patronizing the typist, but you're also describing things at a level that everybody else in the room is going to easily follow what's going on. And you're not going to lose their attention. Because if you say, type the letter A and then a semicolon, and then people are going to drift off. You only do that if necessary. So the next level you can go down to is location. So something that can quite often happen is you say to somebody, go and find this particular method in this particular class, and they go, I don't know where that is. So you tell them which file it's in. You might need to tell them what line you're looking at. Go to line 23, because you might have spotted something that they haven't, and their eyes scanning the page and they can't find what you mean. Line numbers are really handy. So that's location. But then you might find that for whatever reason, somebody needs really a high level of detail, because maybe they don't know the syntax, maybe they don't quite understand what you're saying. So then you might start really giving them a lot of detail. But as quickly as possible, you move back up to the higher level. And that's one way of keeping people engaged. And you need to pay attention to when people are drifting, why people are drifting, what's going wrong, what isn't working, what is working. So pay attention to blockers and also the enablers that address them. So this is a page on the Pro Agile website. which has a whole list of enablers. So for each enabler, it also describes the blockers that they are addressing. So there is lots of descriptions of things that can go wrong with ensembles, and also descriptions of things that you can do to help address them. And there's no way I'm going to go through all of these, but if you join the workshop tomorrow, then you will see all of them in detail. But you can see kindness, consideration, and respect there. Let me pick one. I think Sue has a good idea. That's quite a nice one. So that's where somebody is maybe a bit shy. Maybe people haven't noticed that they're actually quite good at what they do. Maybe they very quietly and shyly suggest things and people don't notice and don't pick up on it, and then somebody else suggests the same thing. So the first thing you can do is actually, if you're noticing that somebody really quiet is not getting the attention they deserve, you can call attention to them and say, I think Sue had a good idea then, and give them the credit they deserve and make sure people are paying attention to them. But you can also, if somebody then says what Sue said, you can say, oh yeah, Sue just said that. You can help to draw attention. That's just one of the enablers. There are many of them. And this is actually one of my favourite bits of the workshop that some of us will be doing tomorrow. I call it the flower exercise. It was Emily's idea originally, but it will make no sense now. But if you join the workshop tomorrow, you'll see what that's all about. And you can experiment with the way that you rotate. So you can experiment with how long you spend between rotations. And you can also do things like, for instance, if it takes a long time to switch typists, you can rotate typists more slowly than you rotate navigators. So for instance, there are some environments where getting yourself set up in the IDE and getting moving can be slow. So you can say the typist rotates every 20 minutes, but the navigator rotates every 5 minutes, so that you don't have those slow handovers. But you can define your own rules, and regular retros are a really big part of that. So you're constantly looking at what you're doing and thinking about how you can make it better. And you don't have to do it all the time, but some do. So this is, so at Hunter Industries, they do ensemble work all the time. This is Cucumber. This was an article written by Sal Freudenberg, who used to work at Cucumber. They used to work as an ensemble most of the time. It can be tempting to think, well, we're only going to use it in emergencies. So, for instance, there's an outage in production, and we need everybody's brains on this. We need the collective wisdom of the whole team. So we're going to stick everybody in a war room, and we're going to bring them together, and they're all going to ensemble in this emergency, high-pressure environment. But if you only ever use it in emergencies, then you're putting people in quite a negative environment where it's going to be harder to practice some of those good practices. And you're not well, unless you have constant emergencies, you're not necessarily going to get enough time to get good at it. So if you do ensemble work on not just the emergencies, then you'll be good enough at it that when there is an emergency, you'll be able to use the ensemble effectively. This is a podcast all about mod programming and ensemble work. There is an interview on there with me about how I used ensemble work with the MadeTech Academy, which was a 12-week bootcamp program that I used to run for MadeTech. And this is the summary. So you can start small, try it. Try doing it for a day, try doing it for half a day, try doing it for a particular feature, try doing it when you're onboarding somebody. But try it before you decide you don't like it. Also, slightly sneaky one, but you don't necessarily have to ask for permission. If you're a team and you know that you want to get good results and you can show good results, who cares how you did it? So try it. And then if it's working well, then tell people about it. Focus on team metrics rather than individual metrics. How is the team doing? What kind of impact is the team having? What are the outcomes of the software that you're developing as a team? And pay attention to long-term quality, so bugs and tech debt over time rather than just how quickly you can deliver one feature. use the opportunity to remove unnecessary ceremonies. Now, if you're all working together as a team, you don't necessarily need a daily stand-up. Instead of having a fortnightly planning meeting, you can actually plan each feature when you do it, because you're all working on it together anyway, and then you're working just in time rather than having a planning meeting and then somebody trying to pick that work up a week later and they've forgotten everything that was said in the planning meeting. Make sure you have regular retros. It's really important. Make your own rules and change them as you go, but start with a strong structure until you get used to it, and then you can decide how you want to change it. Make sure you're keeping people engaged. Agree on the rules of engagement and keep reviewing them. What's important to you now as a team? Let people opt out. That's really important on a daily basis and even on a permanent basis. You may have team members who, for whatever reason, this doesn't work for them. You can't assume that it will. I think you have a good chance of changing people's minds if you give them a positive experience, but there might still be reasons why some people don't want to or can't join in an ensemble. Ideally, that doesn't happen, but you have to allow for people's preferences. You can't be forcing people to do things they hate. And even if you don't, people aren't opting out on a permanent basis, you certainly have to be able to let people opt out on a daily basis, on an ad hoc basis. Apart from anything else, people often have work to do, like timesheets. You're not going to do people's timesheets in an ensemble. You know, there are kinds of work which it makes sense to do individually. You don't force people to do every single thing in the ensemble. Sometimes people go off and do things that are individual to them. But the great thing about the ensemble is you can afford it. You know, if somebody disappears for half an hour, it doesn't matter, because everybody else has got the context and the flow of what's happening, and they can easily catch up when they come back. Pay attention to enables and blockers, and get help. And this is where I do a quick plug for the technical agile coaching with the Saman method, which is something that Emily Bache and I and a bunch of other people do. This is a link to the Saman Technical Coaching Society, and a very strong part of our method is that we work with teams as an ensemble. And this is me. I help people with software delivery. And final plug, this is a report on trunk-based development and continuous integration that I wrote for O'Reilly earlier this year. And we probably don't have time for questions and discussion, but there you go.
Thank you very much, Claire.